voting. So we're not talking about ID or no ID or the integrity of the election process. We're talking about the very deliberate effort to make it less likely that minority voters would have what was necessary or would be able to access the polls as easily as they did and could before that Shelby decision that you talked about. The Shelby decision essentially eliminated the requirement of jurisdictions throughout the South, but in places in the North as well, to submit to a federal authority, either the Attorney General or a federal district court in the District of Columbia, any voting change that they wanted to make. So the Texas voter ID law, for example, is a law that they had attempted to promulgate a couple of years before, and we had challenged it under that preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, and they had been prevented from imposing this voter ID law. Then the Shelby decision comes down, and I remember the very day of that decision in June 2013. 2 hours later, the Attorney General of Texas tweets out his intention of resuscitating this voter ID law that had been stopped under the preclearance provision. Well, now here we are. It's 2017. As I said, we've won that trial. We've won it in the Court of Appeals. But, it's 4 years since 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sure, there's been a presidential election in Texas. But you know what there also have been? There's also been school board elections and county commission elections and town council elections and justice of the peace elections and constable elections and district attorney elections and water commission elections and sheriff elections. And in all of those elections, those are the elections in which we identified across the state that 600,000 people were disenfranchised by those laws. That is an outrage. That is a democratic crisis. And that's what we should be responding to, not responding to this mythological idea of voter fraud and trying to satisfy the president's need to believe that he won the popular vote.
Explain these efforts to me. Why are people who say they so revere the Constitution and so want the country to be run according to the Constitution go to such efforts to keep people from exercising their constitutional right to vote?
Well, it's about what it's always been about. It's about power, and it's about race. And I say that very specifically because, when I do this work, and I was a young voting rights attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the organization I now lead, in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So I'm very familiar with this particular area of work. And people say to me all the time that, this is just about partisan politics. It's not, has nothing to do with race. And, I don't deny that partisan politics plays a role. I think we have reached a point where the two have come together, in very clear alignment. But I remind people of how long, we've been engaged in this voting rights work. Thurgood Marshall often described his most important case not as Brown versus Board of Education, but as a case he won in 1944 in Texas, Smith versus Allwright, which was his case successfully challenging in the United States Supreme Court the Texas all-white Democratic primary. Right? On the theory, what the party said in those days was, we're a private entity. We're not the state. So we can do whatever we want to do. And if we only want to let white people vote in our primary, we can do that. Right? And Thurgood Marshall challenged that all the way up to the Supreme Court, said, no, this is part of the state election structure, right? You can't just have, and remember, in those days in the South, the Democratic Party was the party that controlled everything, right? Before the parties switched really based on race, around issues of race, right? So now we flipped it, right? And now people say, well, it's only partisan politics. Well, it wasn't only partisan politics then in 1944. It was about race, and it's still about race. And so
point.
if you really go to the roots of this work, look, I'm old enough without revealing my age to actually, as a young voting rights attorney, have sued Democratic governors, right? Who then still existed in the South.
Mm-hmm.
When we challenged various voting practices. So I know that if you look at the arc of this work, the parties may change, but the one thing that doesn't change is race. Who are they trying to disenfranchise? It's race. And so when we ask, why do people do this? Look, we just have to be very candid about race in this country at this moment. Let's remember what massive resistance was after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. That was, a manifesto signed by 101 members of Congress that they would resist the Brown versus Board of Education decision by all legal means that they could. This was a decision from the United States Supreme Court and a manifesto signed by 101 congressmen
Wow.
that they would resist Brown versus Board of Education. So I'm not at all confused or alarmed by the idea that people who say they revere our democratic system, say they revere the Constitution, can also be working to undermine the rights of those, who they disfavor, and can be working to undermine constitutional rights at the same time that they are publicly declaring themselves to be the most strong adherents to constitutional democracy.
Given what you said earlier about the centrality of race to this effort, particularly of voter suppression, why on earth do you think